The year is 1801, and Birmingham breathes fire. Tall chimneys spear the sky. Smoke drifts like grey veils across a sun dimmed by industry. The rattle of hammers and hiss of steam roll through the narrow streets, where ironmongers shout prices and horses stamp against the stones slick with soot. Amid the din, a child is born to Richard Tapper Cadbury and his wife, Elizabeth, a boy named John, small of frame but bright of eye, whose cry mingles with the clang of anvils that will one day forge his world. In this restless town of craftsmen and dissenters, the air tastes of metal and ambition. Birmingham is a place of invention, yet within its clatter lives a quieter rhythm, the measured heartbeat of the Quakers, whose meeting houses hum not with machines but with stillness. The Cadburys are of that faith, people who measure worth not by wealth but by conscience. Their home above Richard's linen draper's shop on Bull Street smells of starch and candle wax, the air soft with the dust of folded cloth. Elizabeth keeps the household gentle, instructing her children in temperance and truth. "Let your life speak," she tells them, a phrase the boy would carry like a compass for all his years. When John is sent to Joseph Crossfield's Quaker school in Warwickshire, he finds the silence of meeting days here, both comfort and commandment. He learns that speech, when it comes, must be honest, that prosperity is only virtue when it uplifts others. Outside, the countryside is soft and green, but Birmingham's smoke still clings to him, a reminder of the world's need for cleansing. By adolescence he is restless, too compassionate to accept cruelty, too observant to ignore injustice. He watches climbing boys scramble up chimneys, their faces blackened and raw. He sees drunkards slump against tavern doors while their wives beg for bread, and he wonders, must progress always taste of suffering? The Quakers, denied the universities and the army by law and conviction alike, teach their youth another kind of service. The service of honest trade. Commerce, says his father, is a ministry if done in fairness. And so when apprenticeship beckons, John accepts a post with a tea dealer in Leeds. There he learns the subtleties of flavour and the sanctity of quality, how a leaf's aroma can change with the soil, how a dishonest measure cheats not only the buyer but the soul. He returns to Birmingham in his early 20s with a conviction growing stronger than any business plan, that what people consume shapes not only their bodies but their spirits. The city around him grows harsher each year, streets louder, rivers darker, tempers shorter. Gin is cheaper than bread, and the poor drown their miseries in its bite. John dreams of offering them another cup, not one of intoxication, but of comfort. In 1824, he opens a small shop at 93 Bull Street, the same road where he first drew breath. The window glows with polished tins and glass jars filled with cocoa, tea and mustard. Within, the air is thick with the scent of roasted beans and warm spice. Behind the counter stands Cadbury himself, sleeves rolled, eyes intent, stirring chocolate in a brass pot over a small stove. He greets each customer not as a client but as a neighbour, measuring with care, wrapping each parcel as if it were a promise. The passers-by first come for curiosity, then for comfort. They speak of the young Quaker with the serious eyes, who sells a drink that warms without numbing, who speaks gently even to the roughest labourer. His shop becomes a haven amid the clangor of Birmingham, a little island of civility scented with cocoa and hope. Yet John is not content with profit alone. He watches the working men trudge from factories pale with fatigue, their children barefoot, their wives weary. He joins the poor law guardians where he rails against cruelty, against boys forced up chimneys, against overseers who feast while the hungry starve. He does not shout, he reasons, his calm voice more dangerous to corruption than evenings find him at the Friends' meeting house, head bowed among the faithful, his silence full of purpose. When he rises to speak, his words are few but weighted, that every man and woman deserves dignity, that kindness is not weakness, but strength refined. By his 30th year, the rhythms of his life have settled, business by day, service by night. Yet within him grows a restless ambition. The cocoa trade, still in its infancy, is tainted by adulteration. Merchants mix brick dust or starch to cheapen it. Such deceit offends his Quaker soul. If he is to sell chocolate, it must be pure, a drink that nourishes body and conscience alike. He experiments late into the night, the small firelight glinting on copper pans, the fragrance of roasting beans rising through the rafters. Outside, the street sleeps beneath a haze of coal smoke. Within, a revolution simmers quietly in a single pot. When at last he perfects his blend, rich, dark and honest, he feels not triumph, but peace. He names it simply Cadbury's Cocoa, and it bears not a slogan but a promise. The years ahead will test him. But in that moment, standing in the lamplight of his shop, the young Quaker senses what he has begun. Not merely a business, but a moral endeavour, a drink to steady hands that might otherwise tremble with gin, a sweetness to remind a harsh world of gentler things. And so begins the story of a man who sought to sweeten life itself. While others shouted their principles from pulpits, he lived his. The Quaker creed, simplicity, honesty and peace, shaped every gesture, from the way he measured tea to the manner he addressed a servant. He believed that goodness should be plain yet persistent, like the steady tick of a clock in a restless room. In the Birmingham Friends Meeting House, the stillness was so deep one could hear the scrape of a chair leg echo like a sermon. John often sat with his hands folded, eyes lowered, waiting for the inner voice that Quakers called the light. When he rose to speak, his words were slow, thoughtful, never wasted. He spoke of temperance, of charity, of the duty to lift those whom the city's industry had ground beneath its wheels. Beyond the meeting walls, Birmingham groaned beneath its own creation. The canals glistened with oil. The air hung thick with iron dust. Workmen coughed black phlegm into their sleeves and trudged home to alleyways that reeked of smoke and gin. The streets near Digbeth stank of slaughterhouses, their runoff trickling between the cobbles. It was here that Cadbury's conscience grew restless. For what good was faith if it left the world unsoftened? He began to speak not only within the meeting house, but in public halls, his calm voice carrying through the murmur of larger crowds. He could not abide the hypocrisy of officials who feasted on mutton while children went barefoot. His protests were polite but unrelenting, a new kind of rebellion carried on a current of reason rather than rage. At home on Bull Street, he found solace in work. The smell of roasted cocoa beans had begun to fill the narrow shop, rich and earthy, a counterpoint to the acrid tang of coal outside. To Cadbury, the making of chocolate became an act of healing. It was a drink of warmth and fellowship, an answer to the bottle and the brawl. He sold it pure, no added starch, no brick dust, for deceit, he said, was poison in any form. Evenings often found him with his sleeves rolled, stirring the mixture until it gleamed like polished chestnut. Sometimes a neighbour or apprentice would linger by the fire, watching as he tested a new recipe, murmuring observations about texture and scent. He would smile, modest and precise. "A man's labour," he said once, "should nourish more than his purse." Yet life offered him little peace. The temperance meetings demanded his time, missionary work called him to Ireland, and the endless petitions for reform filled his days. Still, he bore it all with the serene endurance of a man whose purpose was fixed. When others sought recognition, he sought only righteousness. Those who knew him spoke of his gentleness, but it was a gentleness with steel beneath. He was courteous even to opponents, yet unbending where conscience was concerned. He refused to trade in alcohol or profit from cruelty, declining offers that might have doubled his income. There are profits, he said, that impoverish the soul. In the hush of the meeting house, when candles burned low and the world outside rattled with carts and cries, John would sometimes close his eyes and imagine a better Birmingham, a city cleansed of smoke, where honest work bred neither sickness nor despair. He could not yet know that his vision would one day rise in brick and green fields at Bourneville, but already the seed was there, resting quietly in the soil of his resolve. By the early 1830s, the little shop on Bull Street had become a familiar beacon amid Birmingham's din. Its window, always polished to a mirror shine, reflected the blurred bustle of carts and factory smoke outside. Within, the air was heavy with the scent of cocoa and candle grease, a fragrance both exotic and comforting. Customers came not only for drink or spice, but for the peculiar calm that seemed to hang about the young Quaker who served them. John Cadbury had begun to imagine something larger than a shop. Each time he ground cocoa nibs by hand, he felt the limitations of the humble brass pot. He wanted purity on a greater scale, a drink so fine and honest that even the poorest labourer might taste a little dignity. In 1831 he leased a small warehouse in Crooked Lane, its windows dim with grime, its rafters humming with the pulse of nearby factories. There, with a single apprentice and a second-hand mill, he began his first experiments in manufacture. The neighbours thought him eccentric. Why devote such care to chocolate, a luxury known only to the wealthy? But Cadbury saw it differently. Cocoa, he said, might become the temperate man's comfort, an alternative to gin, that liquid ruin flooding England's streets. He tested recipe after recipe, roasting the beans until their shells cracked with a whisper like kindling. The smell drifted through the alleyways, warm, nutty, faintly bitter. Passers-by paused, drawn by curiosity and the promise of sweetness. In 1832 he married Candia Barrow, a woman of quiet courage whose laughter softened his seriousness. Their home above the shop was modest, but full of light. Candia shared his Quaker restraint, yet delighted in the small pleasures of their trade. The gleam of a new tin label, the hiss of the kettle before customers arrived. When she carried a tray of steaming cups to the counter, even the roughest iron worker would remove his cap in gratitude. For a time life seemed settled and kind. But Birmingham's heart was not an easy one. The same furnaces that lit the night sky also burned its people thin. Children worked 12-hour days, women stitched until their fingers bled. John's success weighed upon him. He feared comfort might dull his conscience, so he served again as a poor law guardian, speaking gently yet firmly against neglect. He wrote letters to magistrates demanding better conditions for apprentices and cleaner water for the labouring wards. His cocoa profits, modest though they were, often disappeared into charitable funds. A man's worth, he told Candia, is measured by what he mends. By 1846, recognising the strain upon himself, he invited his younger brother Benjamin into partnership. Thus were born the Cadbury brothers. Together they purchased a larger works in Bridge Street, where the rhythmic thud of machinery joined the city's endless percussion. Here, sacks of beans arrived from distant colonies. Java, the Caribbean, Venezuela, each bearing its own perfume of sun and soil. Workers roasted, ground, and pressed the beans into paste, their hands stained with the brown dust of creation. To walk through the factory was to pass from the sting of smoke to the scent of paradise. John oversaw every detail: the cleanliness of the floors, the fairness of wages, the safety of his people. While other manufacturers drove their employees with fear, Cadbury ruled by respect. He knew each labourer by name and kept a fund for those who fell ill. When profits allowed, he replaced the smoky oil lamps with windows so that daylight might do the work. Some said he was a fool to waste money on comfort. Others saw in him a new kind of master, one who believed prosperity and humanity could share the same roof. Candia's death in 1855 shook him deeply. The house on Bull Street grew silent. The clink of teacups echoed like loss. Yet grief hardened rather than hollowed him. "If the world is cruel," he wrote in his journal, "we must answer with kindness doubled." He poured his morning into work, teaching his sons Richard and George not merely how to make chocolate, but how to live honourably within a world that too often forgot gentleness. By the decade's end, Cadbury's cocoa and chocolate had become a respected name, its reputation resting not on advertisement but on integrity. Each tin carried the promise of purity, each cup a whisper of better living. When customers sipped it, they tasted not indulgence but hope, the notion that sweetness, honestly earned, could redeem even the bitter smoke of Birmingham. The year was 1847, and Birmingham trembled with change. Amid this restless noise, the modest firm of Cadbury Brothers found its stride. Their new Bridge Street factory stood beside the canal like a fortress of brick and steam, its tall windows breathing vapour and purpose into the air. Every morning, John Cadbury arrived before the whistles blew. The workers would see his familiar dark coat moving quietly among them, never aloof, never hurried. He inspected the roasting drums, ran his fingers through the fresh cocoa nibs, and paused to speak with the foreman, or to share a brief word of encouragement with an apprentice. He believed a man's worth could not be measured by his station, and that fairness was the truest form of discipline. Inside, the air shimmered with scent, a mingling of cocoa, sugar, and the faint metallic tang of machinery. Wooden paddles stirred great vats of molten chocolate that glowed like mahogany under lamplight. Outside, horses waited patiently beside the canal barges, snorting plumes of steam into the cold morning air. The workers, men and women alike, earned modest but honest wages, and laboured under conditions that astonished visitors for their cleanliness and order. Cadbury's place, people said, is as pure as the drink itself. John's brother Benjamin, quieter but practical, oversaw the accounts and supply lines. Between them, the partnership was a balance of conscience and craft. John dreamed of moral purpose. Benjamin ensured those dreams were properly costed and shipped on time. Yet even Benjamin could not deny that it was his elder brother's idealism that gave the firm its soul. By mid-century, the brothers were selling dozens of varieties of cocoa and chocolate across Britain. Their tins, plain but elegant, bore the family name as if it were a guarantee of decency. They refused to advertise in the florid style of their rivals. John considered such boasting vulgar. Instead, he relied on the simple persuasion of quality. "Let the product," he said, "speak our character." But success came shadowed with sorrow. In 1856, weary from grief and labour, the brothers dissolved their partnership by mutual consent. Benjamin withdrew from business, and John, whose health had begun to wane, turned his thoughts to retirement. The death of Candia a year earlier had left him hollowed but not defeated. "There are times," he told a friend, "when God requires a man to pass the torch before he falters." That torch was taken up by his sons Richard and George, young men of conviction who had inherited both their father's stern morality and their mother's warmth. Under their guidance, the firm began to stir with new life. The brothers experimented with improved presses and purer butter extraction, producing a smoother, finer chocolate that could rival any in Europe. John, though officially retired, often visited the works, his steps slower now, but his eyes as keen as ever. He would linger by the cooling tables, breathing the familiar fragrance, and smile faintly. "You have made the drink an art," he told them once, "but remember, it began as a prayer." Even in withdrawal, his mind turned toward the welfare of others. He spoke publicly against the poisoning smoke of factories, urging Parliament to recognise the rights of workers to breathe clean air. He petitioned for humane treatment of animals, for Sunday schools, for temperance societies. When asked why he meddled in so many causes, he replied simply, "Because cruelty wears too many faces." At home in Edgbaston, the elder Cadbury's days unfolded in quiet rhythm. Morning walks beneath elm trees, afternoons among ledgers and letters, evenings at the meeting house. The world beyond his garden wall was changing faster than ever. Railways roared, telegraph wires hummed, and cities grew swollen with souls in search of work. Yet John remained steady, a man of an older order, who believed progress must walk hand in hand with mercy. The workers at Bridge Street still spoke of him with affection. They remembered his calm presence in moments of crisis, his refusal to dismiss a man for a single mistake, the way he would bend to speak with a child whose father had taken ill. To them, he was not merely an employer, but a kind of guardian, proof that business need not devour its own humanity. By the dawn of the 1860s, the foundations of his life's work were laid firm. His sons would soon carry the company into a new age, one that John himself might scarcely recognise. But his influence lingered like the aftertaste of good chocolate, warm, subtle, enduring. He had built more than a business, he had built a philosophy, and though he no longer stood behind the counter at Bull Street, the world would go on tasting his faith in every honest cup.